Picture a field in the middle of Kansas. And I'm not talking about like a metaphorical middle of nowhere. I'm talking about the actual geographic middle of the country, specifically Lawrence. Population 95,000. It's the home of the Jayhawks. It's the kind of town that shows up in your peripheral vision when you're driving across I 70 and disappears just as fast. Not much to see there. But in the second week of June, a few hundred people gathered on the lawn outside the University of Kansas to watch an artist named Stan Hurd finish a piece of land art he spent days carving into the grass. And when the cover came off, it wasn't an American flag, it wasn't a Jayhawk, it was the flag of Algeria, a 40-foot crescent and star cut into the earth of a college town in the heart of the United States. Hurd talked to ABC News afterward, and he says something that I've not been able to put down since I read it. He said, everybody had goosebumps. I've never seen a more joyous crowd. It wasn't the flag, it wasn't the art, it was the embrace of the community. It wasn't the flag, he said, it was the embrace. That sentence is this whole episode. The FIFA World Cup is about halfway through, and I'm jumping on the bandwagon to spend the next half hour or so unpacking what's going on, all framed through the lens of hospitality. Welcome to this week's episode.
Unhospitality, the #1 podcast in the world.
Now, if you listen to the show for any length of time, you'll know that one of my main themes is travel is the best cure for ignorance that I've ever found. You go somewhere that isn't yours and you eat something you can't pronounce, you get lost in a city where you don't speak the language, and something in you that was rigid just gets a little bit more elastic. I built the entire philosophy of unhospitality around that idea, bringing you the untold stories that highlight the idea that proximity to difference, real proximity, physical and uncomfortable and in your face difference, is what actually dissolves prejudice. And for years, my framing has been you have to go to it. You got to leave your driveway. You've got to get beyond your front door. The empathy doesn't come to you. You go out and get it. You get on a plane, on a bus, on the back of someone's motorbike in a country where you don't know the rules yet. That's where you're going to find that empathy. But this summer broke some of that framing, and I want to be honest about how much I didn't see it coming. Because this time, the world didn't wait for Americans, or for North America to be more exact, to go find it. It got on a plane and came to North America. It set up camp in Atlanta, Kansas City, Boston, a dozen other cities throughout North America that most of these countries' fans had never set foot in. And the cure for ignorance, ironically, showed up in US zip codes. There's a number that I think explains why this landed the way it did, and it's not just a World Cup number. Nielsen has been tracking the growth of the sport. Football is what's called throughout the world, soccer in the US, for years. And while I've played football all my life, I've been a fan for as long as I can remember. The data shows that North America is catching on. It's now sitting at about 136 million soccer fans, up almost 11% in just 5 years. Now, the US alone accounts for 62.5 million of those. So US football fans are not a niche anymore. Before this tournament ever kicked off, the US had built the emotional foundation to receive what was about to happen to it. So when I say the world came home, I don't mean it arrived in a vacuum. I mean, it arrived in soil that had already been turned over and cultivated, ready for something to grow. And what grew was bigger than anyone running the marketing for this tournament could have planned for. My IG feed has been a fire hose of feel-good stories around this World Cup, and I am so here for it. I've been weeping, crying, laughing, really getting caught up in this moment. But let me make a comment about one thing I find distasteful about US culture. It's engineered around privacy, around the cul-de-sac and the attached garage and the 6-foot fence and the I keep to myself vibe. You know, a country where the third place, you know what the third place is? It's like the bar, the plaza, or just a cafe in a corner where just strangers exist near each other. That has been quietly going extinct for 75 years. And for 1 month, in pockets all over this continent, that architecture, that kind of ethos has gotten interrupted. Strangers sang together, strangers cried together, strangers from 5 different continents stood shoulder to shoulder in stadium concourses and somehow understood each other completely without sharing a single word of vocabulary or a shared culture. I want to take you to 3 places where that happened in a way that actually changed something. And then I want to take you onto the pitch itself, because the same story, the world showing up and refusing to be small, was happening between the lines on the pitch and not just in the stands. It's really some really great stories here. Let's go back to that field, okay, in Kansas. Lawrence didn't accidentally end up hosting the Algerian national team. This was intentional. This was 2 years of planning. Back in early 2025, several groups in Douglas County, where Lawrence is, formalized what they called a unified command structure, just to prepare logistically for the idea that an African nation's entire football operation, players and coaches, families, support staff, was going to live in town for a month. Rock Chalk Park, the University of Kansas's athletic complex, got selected as Algeria's base camp. It's where they were going to train in preparation for the World Cup. And the city's tourism arm, Explore Lawrence, put out a statement that I think is worth repeating in full because I read it again now, and everything that's happened since, it almost sounds prophetic. What they said was, "We are confident our efforts will result in visitors experiencing what it's like to be a local in Lawrence in a safe, welcoming, and fun environment." Now that's a press release. Press releases are usually like where good intentions get crammed into a watered down, stale marketing pitch. But this one actually lived up. It actually happened. How did that happen? From the moment the Algerian team's plane landed, they were met by thousands of people, and not just curious Kansans. There's already a sizable Algerian immigrant community in the Kansas City metro area, people who built their lives there long before anyone announced a base camp. And suddenly, their adopted hometown was boasting their actual homeland's national team. Gatherings sprang up at a Mediterranean market in Olaf. Forgive me if I pronounce that wrong. People who'd been there quietly in their Algerian American identity in the middle of the country finally got to be loudly, visibly, and joyfully Algerian American for a month. Now, some of these scenes that I saw made me weep. Lawrence natives started showing up on Algerian television. Algerian sports outlets were sending reporters to a college town in the middle of Kansas to ask 20-something-year-old soccer players what it felt like to have the Desert Foxes, which is the name of the Algerian team, in their backyard. One of them, a kid named Ocean Comfort, and yes, that is his name, Ocean Comfort, told an Algerian outlet that he hoped the team would win their group, which, by the way, included the defending champion, Argentina. He said, "A good nation, a good team. I feel like they're good people, so I love to support them." A good nation and good people, said by a college kid in Kansas about a country most Americans couldn't locate on a map a year ago. And let's be honest, in these polarizing times where immigrants, particularly from African nations, are having the welcome mat removed, this warm welcome, well, to me, it's a breath of fresh air. And then there's a line that broke me a little bit. And I think this is the emotional center of this whole episode. A Lawrence resident, an old man, kind of like scraggly looking, he did an interview that went viral. He's just a regular guy. He didn't have a title, he was no official role. He looked into the camera and said, "I want to say thank you." I get emotional, "to the Algerian team for choosing our hometown, Kansas, to come here." Now let's talk about the grammar of that sentence for a second. He didn't say thank you for visiting. He said thank you for choosing us. That's hospitality as gratitude for being seen. The town didn't just open its doors and let the team in. It felt honored to be chosen as a host city. In all the videos I've seen shown what an honor that it was to be chosen and how they've reflected that. The University of Kansas's Spencer Museum of Art got in on it too. They mounted an exhibition called Welcoming the World to Lawrence. And they pulled pieces from their permanent collection connected to the 8 countries with players or matches in the Kansas area. Um, Algeria, Argentina, Austria, Curacao, Ecuador, England, the Netherlands, and Tunisia. The museum looked at the sporting event and said, "This is a cultural moment, and we have an obligation to meet it as one." I mean, it's really a powerful message what they've done here in Lawrence, Kansas. And here's a part I have to be honest with you about, because if I don't, this whole segment is just a nice story and almost like a puff piece and nothing more. I was challenged by this. Specifically, my own prejudices were challenged because my read on middle America, and I think it's kind of a fair read given the fact that like a wild accusation that immigrants in middle America were eating cats and dogs and that gained so much traction. Like, how do you believe that? You know, my read has never been a small town in Kansas rolls out a red carpet for North African nation and organizes a 2-year unified effort to do it properly, and they mean it. I mean, the storyline doesn't fit the framework that I walk around with most days. And I don't think I should pretend it does just because it's a heartwarming clip. I think the more honest thing to do is to admit it. This challenged me and expanded what I thought about middle America, or at least pockets of it, and what it was capable of doing and feeling and extending care for people who pray and look and speak differently than they do. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole premise of every episode I've ever made, why we should leave our front doors. Except this time, I didn't have to leave my front door to learn it. Lawrence did the work for me. They brought this message to me, and I'm very grateful. And I'm going to hold on to that. And unfortunately, I'm going to hold on to this next part right next to it because it happened in the same month, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Let's talk about the fact that the same country that organized this 2 year welcome plan for the Algerian national team this spring, it also required citizens of roughly 50 nations, Cape Verde included, we'll come back to that, to post visa bonds of up to $15,000 just to attend the tournament that their own teams were playing in. Fans from Ivory Coast and Senegal were denied visas outright, with reporting suggesting that officials didn't want supporters from certain countries on American soil. Senegalese players were pulled aside for individual security searches. Uzbekistan's delegation got checked over by narcotics dogs ahead of a friendly. So, in contrast, the welcome in Lawrence, Kansas was real, but it was also not the whole country. It was not even close to universal. I don't say that to take anything away from Stan Hurd's flag in the grass or from the guy who thanked Algeria for choosing his hometown. Those are beautiful, beautiful moments. I say it because the gap between those two realities, the full throated welcome in Kansas to the $15,000 bonds and drug dogs at the border, is the actual subject of this show. Genuine hospitality and performative hospitality can exist in the same country, at the same time, in the same month, often pointed at people from the same continent. Lawrence chose one, the visa officer chose the other. Both are America, and I don't think you get to claim only the one that makes you feel good. They're both part of reality. So if Lawrence is a surprise, Mexico City is proof that it isn't a fluke because Mexico City has been running this experiment for a while now, and the results keep coming back the same. Go back to 2018 for context. The World Cup was in Russia, and Mexico needed South Korea to beat Germany in the first round in order for Mexico to advance to the second round. Now, this was a Germany, by the way, that was a reigning world champion and with basically no realistic path to losing to a Korean side that had already been eliminated. But it happened anyway. Korea won 2-0, and the Mexican fans in the middle of the night poured onto the streets of Mexico City and went straight to the South Korean embassy to celebrate. They chanted a phrase that's become legend in both countries. Coreano, hermano, ya eres mexicano, which translates to Korean, brother, you are now Mexican. So that's 8 years of history sitting underneath everything that's happening in this June in the World Cup in Mexico. So when South Korea came back to Mexico for this tournament, the relationship didn't have to be built from scratch. It had to be just reignited a little bit, reopened. Guadalajara, hosting Korea fans for group matches, didn't treat it as a logistics problem. They actually updated city infrastructure to welcome an estimated 20,000 Asian visitors, including putting up street signs in Hangul, which is the Korean alphabet, throughout the city. Think about the civic decision-making requirement for that. Someone in a planning meeting said, we're expecting thousands of guests from a specific country, and the right response is to make signage legible to them. Talk about a warm welcome. My mind like blown, right? The streets delivered on what the signage promised. Plaza Liberacion in Guadalajara turned out to what one reporter called pure camaraderie. Korean tourists and Mexican locals trading tequila cantaritos for K-pop, dancing to mariachi, posing in charo hats next to each other like they were at their cousin's wedding. There's a video that went viral of a single Korean fan alone in a sea of Mexican supporters getting hoisted into the air and thrown by the crowd in celebration, the way you'd like toss a teammate after winning a goal. Beautiful scenes. When both teams won their openers on the same day, the chant from the 2018 World Cup came right back out like it had just been waiting in storage for the right occasion. Coreano, hermano, ya eres mexicano, essentially establishing a brotherhood between the two countries. There's a piece of this that goes back even further than 2008 too, and it's worth a beat because this kind of detail that turns a fun viral moment into something with actual roots. Korean immigration to Mexico goes back to 1905. It's kind of an unfortunate story. Indentured laborers who came to work for the Kenikin plantations of the Yucatan. That's 120 years of Korean presence on Mexico's soil, but it's been mostly invisible to the outside world until now we have the soccer tournament that gives it a reason to surface. The brotherhood chant that we're hearing is a callback on multiple levels, and it harkens back to something that's been quietly true for over a century. Koreans and Mexicans, there's a brotherhood there. And it wasn't only Korea. In the same country, in Mexico City, a few days later, well, it turned a different color entirely, that city. Colombia played Uzbekistan at the Azteca, and Mexico City didn't just host a match. It got annexed. It got taken over in a sea of yellow Colombian jerseys. Thousands of fans took over the restaurants and the food halls across the capital before kickoff. They were eating bandeja paisa, which is a nice nod to from Mexico to Colombia. It's one of my favorite Colombian staples. And they were eating empanadas and singing in the streets like it was a hometown final instead of a group stage opener 3,000 kilometers from Bogota. At a food hall in the Romer neighborhood, a place called, with no apparent sense of irony, Dining Room of Miracles. The energy went through the roof when the Colombian singer Carlos Vives showed up in person, and fans took it as a sign that their team was destined to win. And they were right. Colombian took it 3-1. And by the way, if you haven't seen Colombia's third and final goal, stop this episode right now and go watch it. Cucho Hernandez, who had the assist on the goal, he gives a masterclass in grit, determination, and a never say die attitude. The man got pummeled and he got right back up and gave the assist. It was pure brilliance, pure inspiration. Check it out. But back to Mexico City, by the final whistle of the Colombia game, hundreds of supporters, Colombians and their Mexican brothers, had regrouped at the Ángel de la Independencia, which is a monument in the heart of the city of Mexico. The videos I've seen of the celebration gave me some serious FOMO. I so wanted to be there. So, what ties Lawrence and Mexico City together, even though one is a college town of 95,000 and the other is one of the largest metro areas on the planet? Well, neither city treated the visiting fans as a logistics problem to be managed. They treated them as family arriving. Lawrence updated its civic identity around a North African nation it had very little prior connection to. Imagine that. Mexico City closed their streets down so a fellow Latin American country could celebrate a win. Beyond tourism infrastructure to generate revenue streams, it's hospitality as a civic virtue, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing to behold. Now, I want to take you out of the stands and onto the grass because there's some stories here that are amazing of the small and overlooked refusing to stay small. And what's happening on the field is just as important and heartwarming as what's happening in the stands. There's one match and one player, I think, that says it better than anything I could write from scratch. There's a stat line from one of the opening games in Atlanta that tells you almost nothing and everything at the same time. Spain, 27 shots, 74% possession of the ball in 11 corner kicks. Cabo Verde, 6 shots, 26% of possession, 1 corner kick. And the final score, 0-0, 0-0. On paper, Spain should have thrashed Cabo Verde. They should have won that game 3 times over. They had Pedri pulling strings in midfield and one of the most talented stars on the planet coming off the bench. The betting markets were so confident going in that the books had Spain at a minus 1,500 to beat Cabo Verde. You bet $1,000 on Spain, you win about $60. That's it. Because nobody thought the outcome was actually in question. But standing in the way of all of it was one 40-year-old man. He didn't turn professional until he was 25, an age where most World Cup goalkeepers are already established and assigned to a top flight team. He spent the next 15 years bouncing through some of the least glamorous leagues in all of football. In Angola, Moldova, Cyprus, Slovakia, the Portuguese second division. He never once played for a club that anyone outside of hardcore football circles could name. His Instagram had 50,000 followers the morning of the match. Afterwards, he skyrocketed. He's up to 17 million followers right now. His name is Josemar Jose Evora Diaz. Nobody calls him that. They call him Vozinha, which is translated to little grandmother. It's a nickname that some older kids hung on to him when he was small because he'd run home crying to his grandparents whenever they beat him on the soccer pitch. And on June 15th in Atlanta, Vozinha made 7 saves on the biggest stage of his career and didn't blink. He dove full stretch to deny Spain from point blank range. He read a corner kick and got fingertips on a header that looked for a brief second like it was a certain goal. He did this for 90 minutes against a team that had more individual talent on its bench than Cabo Verde had in its entire field. But when the final whistle blew, he became the oldest player ever to appear in a nation's first World Cup match. This was the first time Cabo Verde had been at the World Cup. It actually broke a record, by the way, that had just been set the day before by Curaçao's goalkeeper, literally one day earlier. And by the way, Vozinha is the 3rd oldest goalkeeper in the tournament history to keep a clean sheet. And here's what I can't get past. Cabo Verde, 10 islands off the coast of West Africa, population of around 500,000 or so, smaller than Tulsa, by the way, was for over 400 years a Portuguese colony, and for a really ugly reason. The island functioned as a holding station in the transatlantic slave trade. Ships moved through Cape Verdean ports loaded with human beings bound for the Americas. The wealth extracted, the suffering inflicted, the entire colonial machine that ran straight through the archipelago of Cape Verde centuries before Cape Verde finally won their independence in 1975. And here we are, 51 years later, a Cape Verdean goalkeeper stood in a net in Atlanta, Georgia, and didn't let Spain through. Now, of course, Spain was not their colonizer, it was Portugal, very close relatives. I'm not going to pretend this scoreless draw rewrites 400 years of extraction. It doesn't. And it would be cheap for me to suggest otherwise. But I don't think it's nothing either. There's something close to poetic justice in watching a nation that was used by a European empire for centuries show up on a global stage and simply refuse to be beaten. There was no outside intervention, no charity, just skill, heart, discipline, and a 40-year-old man who's been told his whole life by childhood bullies, by leagues, by scouts, that he doesn't belong on the stage. And yet he stood his ground anyway. I mean, I get chills. Amazing, amazing story. This wasn't an isolated case of the little guy getting lucky either. This same tournament had Egypt take a lead on Belgium, one of Europe's most experienced and battle-tested squads, before getting pulled back to a draw. Egypt's organization and attacking threat earning them a result that flips the usual script of an African side as an easy point for European royalty. Go back 4 years, by the way, to Qatar, and you'll find the same pattern. Tunisia beating France, the nation that had colonized it, by the way, in the group stage. Morocco, a nation France also colonized, hello, France, going all the way to World Cup semifinal, the first African team in history to do so, with their run including a win over Spain along the way, another European power. This isn't a one off feel good story. I'm seeing a pattern with a direction, and the direction that keeps pointing to it's the same. Formerly colonized nations meet their former colonizers on a football pitch as equals. And increasingly, they're the better team that day. So now here's another detail that keeps this from becoming a tidy redemption arc because nothing in this tournament gets to stay tidy. FIFA is ugly sometimes, and as much as I love football, it can get really ugly behind the scenes. Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, is one of roughly 50 countries whose citizens have faced visa bans of up to $15,000 just to enter the States, part of a broader crackdown on travelers from nations flagged for high visa overstay rates. Now, the bond requirement only got suspended for ticket holders from Cape Verde and 4 other World Cup nations last month. So, by most accounts, that suspension came far too late for plenty of fans who'd already given up making the trip in the first place, including, by the way, Bosinia's mother. If you saw his interview following the draw against Spain, he was crying because his mother couldn't be there because of the visa complications. She had to get special help to get to the next game. So the country whose goalkeeper became a global folk hero overnight, whose Instagram followers exploded from 50,000 to over 17 million followers since that match, is a country whose own citizens had to clear a $15,000 financial hurdle just to watch him do it in person. So the grip of the old colonial hierarchy loosens up on the pitch, but is tightened at the border. And that's, I think, a real disparity here. I don't think necessarily it's a contradiction in this tournament. I think that is this tournament. There's these parallel stories that are very conflicting. The same month, the same headlines, the same nation hosting both stories at once. Wake up to these realities and let's see that for every good story, there's some stuff behind the scenes that we fundamentally need to change. Let's go back to Wosinia. He said something after that match that's been in my head ever since. And he said, I would tell the 18-year-old Wosinia to be really proud of himself. I have worked my whole life for this moment. Ah, what a moment, what a man. 40 years old, coming from islands of volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic, with 400 years of extraction sitting behind him, and a border policy in front of him, quietly telling him and his own countrymen that they don't quite belong. And he didn't let Spain in anyway. So what does all this mean, this football talk for the people who do this hospitality for a living? You know, I make this show for people in the industry as much as I make it for fans. So let me bring this back down to where I actually live, in hotels and venues and destinations, the people who get paid to make strangers feel like they belong somewhere just for a few nights. Here's a lesson sitting underneath everything I just told you, okay? The destinations that won this tournament, the places that we've talked about here from Lawrence to Mexico City, well, they weren't the ones with the biggest activation budgets. They were the ones who treated the arriving culture as something to be honored, not managed. Something to be honored, not managed. Lawrence didn't run a focus group on Algerian hospitality preferences. They put a 40-foot Algerian flag on the actual earth of their university, and they let the community show up, and the feelings flowed from there. Guadalajara didn't hire a translation consultant to optimize signage conversion. They put up They put up Hangul because the Korean guests deserved to read their own language on a Mexican street corner. Full stop. They wanted to make their guests feel welcome. Compare that to the instinct most of our industry still defaults to: contain the disruption, manage the foot traffic, optimize the photo op, get the visiting delegation through as security as fast as possible so they stop being a variable or a distraction. That instinct is exactly what produced the other half of the story: the $15,000 bonds, the individual searches, narcotic dogs being like your greeting at the airport of a friendly delegation that made them feel like a threat more than a guest. Both responses are available to any city and any hotel, any brand at any given moment. This tournament just happened to put both responses on a split screen for the whole world to see in the same month, sometimes involving the same countries. So if you're in this business, the takeaway isn't complicated, even if it's hard to execute. Community is not a backdrop you rent for a marketing photo. It's the actual product when it's real. And it's a liability the second a guest can smell it, that it's staged. People can feel the difference between a welcome and a transaction in about 4 seconds. And once they feel that it's a transaction, you don't get that trust back for the rest of the trip. It's that simple. Be genuine in your welcome, roll out the red carpet from your heart and not just as part of a process. I want to leave you back where this started. Let's take it back to the field in Kansas, the cover coming off of Stan Hurd's flag, cut into the grass of the university most of these Algerian players had never heard of 18 months earlier. Hurd said it wasn't the flag, it was the embrace. I think that's the whole argument of the show, distilled into 11 words by a land artist in Lawrence, Kansas. The flag was never the point. The flag is just a thing you can point a camera at. It's the embrace. That's the actual event. The choice made by ordinary people with no incentive beyond their own decency to treat a stranger's presence as an honor instead of an inconvenience. The US, Mexico, Canada didn't have to leave its driveway to learn that lesson this summer. The world brought it directly to their doorstep, to a college town in the middle of a country, to a goalkeeper nobody had ever heard of until he refused to lose, to a plaza in Guadalajara that decided to learn to write in a language it didn't speak a year ago. I say it again, the cure for ignorance showed up in the best way possible, all over North America for about a month. The only question that matters, now that the tournament's half over and the cameras will soon start to look elsewhere for the next news cycle, who's been paying close enough attention to keep doing this warm embrace once the world goes home? I hope Lawrence keeps the flag in the grass as long as it possibly can. If you like this show, support us with a like and a follow, a comment. Really appreciate your support, guys. This is Unhospitality. Until the next time, safe travels.